คนเมืองกับน้ำห่างไกลกันมาก เราลองถามคนเมืองเกี่ยวกับการประหยัดน้
ก็ไม่สนใจเฉย
ำก็รู้นะ แต่ไม่อยากทำหรอก ความในใจของน้ำที่มองไม่เห็นทำอะไรน่ะเซฟวอเตอร์ดริงเบียร์ไง โอ้ไม่นะ นี่เขาคงไม่รู้ใช่ไหม เราต้องตายไปขนาดไหน กว่าจะได้เบียร์1 แก้ว พวกมนุษย์น้ำที่มองไม่เห็น เราทุกคนใช้น้ำกันทุกเวลา ทั้งรู้และไม่รู้ตัว เพราะน้ำถูกซ่อนไว้ในร่างต่างๆ จนบางทีเราก็มองไม่เห็น เป็นน้ำเสมือน กว่าจะเป็นไข่ไก่1 ฟอง ต้องใช้น้ำเลี้ยงแม่ไก่135 ลิตร สเต็กเนื้อ300 กรัม ใช้น้ำ 4,500 ลิตร กางเกงยีน1 ตัว ใช้น้ำ 11,000 ลิตร เซฟวอเตอร์ดริงเบียร์จึงเป็นเรื่องที่ผิด เพราะเบียร์1 แก้วใช้น้ำถึง170 ลิตร เราเรียกการใช้น้ำทั้งทางตรงและทางอ้อมว่า100 ตีนน้ำ ยิ่งใช้เยอะก็ยิ่งใหญ่ คนทั่วโลกใช้น้ำเฉลี่ย 1,243 ลูกบาศก์เมตรต่อปี คนอเมริกามี100 ตีนน้ำใหญ่สุดถึง 2,483 ลูกบาศก์เมตร คนไทย
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. Sawadee krab. We have just seen part of the performance from the southern part of Thailand. They are school children from the local communities, taught by national artists who is now 76 years old already, in order to preserve the culture of the local community in the region. And they will be with us this evening as well. The second ABU Media Summit on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction is now about to open. And on this occasion, may I first of all invite Dr. Chawat Mutashi, Secretary General of the Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union, to come to the stage and extend warm welcome to all delegates. Dr. Chawat, please.
ขึ้นกล่าวต้อนรับผู้เข้าร่วมประชุมทุกท่านเลยนะครับดร.ชวัตเชิญครับ
Wang Arirat, Director General Thai PBS,
ท่าน
members of the
ผู้อำนวย
board,
การของไทย PBS ท่าน
distinguished guests,
กรรมการ
ladies
ท่าน
and
แข
gentlemen,
กผู้มี
colleagues.
เกียรติท่านสุภาพบุรุษ
ส
สุ
วัสดี
ภา
ครั
พ
บ
สตรีสวัสดีครับ
I have the honor
ผม
and
ได้รับ
pleasure
เกียรติและ
to
มีความยิน
welcome
ดี
you all
ที่จะ
to
ต้อ
the
นรับ
ABU
ท่าน
Media Summit
เข้า
on
สู่การ
Climate
ประชุม
Change
สุดยอดด้าน
and
สื่อสารมวลชน
Disaster
ว่าด้วย
Risk
การเปลี่ยน
Reduction.
แปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศและการลดความเสี่ยง
It could
จากภั
not
ยพิบัติ
be
ซึ่ง
more
การประชุมครั้ง
appropriate
นี้เหมาะสม
to hold this
ที่สุด
second
แล้ว
annual
ที่
event
จะจัด
than the beautiful
การประชุม
Krabi
ครั้งที่สอง
province,
นี้ในจังหวัดกระบี่
which
อันสวย
suffered
งาม
so much
ซึ่งได้รับ
devastation
ผลกระทบอย่าง
in the
มาก
deadly
มายใน
2004
เหตุ
Indian
การณ์
tsunami,
สึนามิ
Indian Ocean tsunami.
จากมหาสมุทรอินเดียในปี
Nearly
2004
1,400 lives were lost here.
1,400
When you look
มี
around,
ผู้เสีย
no
ชีวิต
one
เกือบ
would believe
1,400 คนที่
that
นี่
the
ซึ่ง
infrastructure
เมื่อมอง
was
ไปรอบๆ
devastated.
แล้วคงไม่มีใครสามารถ
The
เชื่อ
fishery
ได้ว่าโครง
industry
สร้างพื้น
laid in
ฐานนั้น
ruins.
ถูกทำลายอุตสา
That
ห
is
กรรม
the
การประมง
resilience
นั้นถูก
which is
ทำลา
the
ย
spirit
สิ่งที่
of
เรา
the
เห็น
people
นี้คือ
in
ความสามารถ
Thailand.
ในการฟื้นตัวของประชาชน
Krabi
ใน
has
ประเทศไทย
recovered
จังหวัด
so
กระ
well
บี่นั้นได้
that
ฟื้นตัวได้
the
ดีมาก
marks
เหลือ
of
เกิน
that
จน
disaster
ร่อง
can no
รอยของ
longer
ภัย
be
พิบัติ
seen.
ครั้งนั้นไม่สามารถที่จะมองเห็นได้อีกต่อ
One
ไป
must pay tribute to
เรา
the
คงจะ
people
ต้
of
อง
Krabi
ชื่นช
for
ม
their
ประชาชน
determination
ชาวกระ
to
บี่
raise
ซึ่ง
their
มีความมุ่ง
community
มั่นในการ
from
ที่
the
จะ
ruins.
ฟื้น
They
ชุม
give
ชน
us
ของตนเองขึ้น
inspiration
มา
to
จากความ
press
เสียหาย
ahead
ซึ่ง
with
ทำ
the
ให้เรา
ABU
มีแรงบัน
Climate
ดาล
and
ใจ
Disaster
ในการที่
Literacy
จะ
Campaign.
ทำโครงการให้ความ
This
รู้
is a campaign
ของ
to
ABU
use
ต่อไป
media
ซึ่ง
to
เป็นโครง
build
การ
knowledgeable,
ที่จะใช้
strong
ในการ
communities
ที่จะสร้างประชา
able
ค
to
มชุมช
turn
น
the
ที่มี
climate
ความ
change challenges
เข้มแข็ง
into
ที่จะ
opportunities
สามารถ
and survive
เปลี่ยนแปลงค
the
วามท้าทาย
brutal
ทางด้านการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพ
forces
ภูมิอา
of
กาศ
nature.
ไปทำให้เรา
Krabi
สามารถ
is of
อยู่รอด
course a
ได้
very
กระบี่
different
แน่นอน
location for
นั้น
this conference
ก็
compared to
เป็น
the
ที่
first
ตั้งของ
of
การ
its
ประ
kind
ชุม
held
ที่
in
แตกต่างจากการประชุม
2014
ครั้งแรกในปี
in the capital
2014
city
ซึ่ง
of
เราจัดการ
Indonesia,
ประชุมใน
Jakarta.
กรุงจาการ์ตา
But
เมือง
whether
ของประเทศ
people
อินโดนี
live
เซี
in a
ย
densely
แต่ไม่ว่า
populated
ประชาชน
city
จะอยู่
or
ใน
in
เมื
a
องซึ่งมีประ
rural
ชากรแน่น
surrounding
หนา
of
หรือ
Krabi,
ว่าอยู่
communities
ใน
all
สภาพ
over
แวดล้อม
Asia and the
ชน
Pacific
บทอย่าง
are
เช่นกระบี่
becoming
นี้
ever
ผู้
more
คนในเอเชียแปซิฟิก
defenseless
นั้
to
น
the negative
ก็
impacts
ล้วนได้รับ
of
ผลกระ
climate
ทบ
change.
จากการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิ
We
อากาศ
know
ทั้
that
งสิ้น
wherever
เราทราบ
we live,
ว่า
there
ไม่
are
ว่าเราจะ
melting
อยู่ที่
ice
ใดก็
caps
ตามก็
at the
มี
north
น้ำ
and
แข็ง
south
ละลาย
poles.
ทั้งทางขั้วโลกเหนือและ
Our
ขั้วโลก
Earth
ใต้
is slowly
โลกของ
warming
เรา
up,
นั้น
and
มีส
as
ภาพ
a
ภูมิ
result,
อากาศ
the
ที่อบอุ่น
oceans
ขึ้น
are
และ
rising.
ผลจากอุณหภูมิ
This
ที่เพิ่ม
global
ขึ้นนั้นทำให้ระดับ
phenomenon
น้ำทะเล
impacts
สูง
all of
ขึ้น
us,
ซึ่ง
and we
ส่ง
have
ผล
to
กระทบ
take
ต่อพวกเราทุก
responsibility to act quickly with one main purpose: to save lives.
นั่นคือ
Whether we are broadcasters providing a reliable public service or professionals involved in this major challenge, disaster risk reduction, saving lives can only be achieved through communicating knowledge not merely to the present generation, but also by sustaining the efforts of today through steadily building a bank of knowledge for the future. I appeal to you all, combine the message of Krabi's experience with your deliberations during the summit, and spread them far and wide in the full knowledge that this, the second event of its kind, is not the end but just another step in an ongoing process. I thank you all for joining this summit. I thank all the speakers, all moderators, all contributors. And my special thanks goes to Thai PBS and especially my friend Krisida and his hardworking colleagues in Thai PBS for being wonderful for this summit. On that note, I wish you a very successful gathering. Thank you.
And also on this occasion, may I request Dr. Chawat Mutachi to also hand over the flag of the Media Summit to Mr. Grisada Rungarirat, Director General of Thai Public Broadcasting Service. And as you are already here, Mr. Grisada Rungarirat, Director General of Thai Public Broadcasting Service, may I ask you to also extend warm welcome to all distinguished delegates, please.
Secretary General of ABU, Dr. Jadet, distinguished member of ABU and member of Board of Government of Thai PBS, member of the civil society and all delegates in this summit. First of all, on behalf of Thai Public Broadcasting Service, or we call Thai PBS, it is indeed our honor for me to receive the Media Summit Fact and to host the second ABU Media Summit on climate change and disaster risk reduction. I wish to extend our warm welcome to all of you to the Media Summit held in Krabi. Krabi, one of the most beautiful provinces in Thailand. And as you know, Krabi is the area hit by the tsunami 12 years ago, and we lost many people here. At that time, Thai PBS has a chance to participate and learn how to play a new role of media in disaster. That in this summit, we can have a chance to share that we found here. We found that media not only to report the occurrence of the disaster, but also we work closely with all the stakeholders for helping the people from the suffer. The first ABU Media Summit held in Jakarta in 2014. During the past 2 years, there are a number of disasters takes place in the regions around and all around the world. We have encountered with the climate change related disasters such as tornado, typhoon, flood, landslide, and drought. Most recently, our friend has to suffer from the earthquake striking in Myanmar, Japan, and Ecuador. And also, in the past 2 years, many of us here also attend a various conference on disaster and disaster reduction. All the conference concern the role of the media in the reporting extremely situation. But can the media do more than just reporting? Can we enhance our role to increase the awareness of the people about the disaster management and disaster risk reduction? The Sendai framework for the disaster reduction emphasize that the role of the stakeholder in taking action and sharing responsibility in reducing the disaster risk, and the media should play an active role to stimulate a culture of prevention and strong community involvement. At the second summit, we are pleased to have a representative from various stakeholders such as the media, civil society, volunteer, academic people, professional association, and government organization. It is therefore our chance to sharing, and I hope that we will be able to share our knowledge and experience in this summit. At this time, I now have an honor to declare the second ABU Summit on Climate Change and Disaster Reduction open. Thank you.
And also to mark the opening of the second ABU Media Summit on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction, may I also once again invite Dr. Chawat Mutaji to join Director General of Thai PBS in beating the drum to mark the opening of the summit. We have now opened the second ABU Media Summit on Disaster Risk Reduction. The youngest performer is 5 years old. Okay. And now, ladies and gentlemen, to officially open our sessions, we will start with the video clips by Mr. Robert Glasser, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of UNISDR. So, video clips, please.
Dear ABU members, thanks very much for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today. As many of you know, last year was the hottest year on record, and over 90% of disasters caused by natural hazards were weather or climate related. Asia accounted for almost 72% of worldwide deaths from natural hazards. In Nepal, over 8,800 people lost their lives in the April earthquake. Thousands more died in heat waves and floods in India and Pakistan, and hundreds lost their lives in storms. Drought, partly linked to El Niño, continues to affect several countries. Climate change, of course, is a strong driver of disaster risk in Asia. Cyclones, which have always threatened the region, are growing in intensity and unpredictability thanks to warming oceans and rising sea levels. Every coastline in Asia is vulnerable to these storms. So one piece of good news is that deaths from climate and weather-related disasters are on the decline, thanks to the growing spread of a culture of disaster risk reduction across the region. Fewer people are dying in storms, thanks to better weather forecasts, satellite images, early warning systems, and timely evacuations. And broadcasting outlets can take a lot of credit for this improved performance because of their news coverage and support to the dissemination of disaster risk information. The role of the media in reducing disaster risk losses and raising public awareness is recognized for the first time in a major international agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted last year in Sendai, Japan. The media should look beyond the immediate impact of a disaster to explain what can be done to tackle the underlying drivers of disaster risk, such as climate change, but also inappropriate land use, environmental degradation, and poor urban planning. Exposure to climate risk is usually most acute among the poorest members of society, so a focus on what makes people vulnerable to disasters is critical, in the media in particular, if we are to reduce the numbers of people dying in these events. This year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction on Thursday, October 13, will focus on reducing mortality from disasters. Reducing mortality is the first target of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's an essential target. I hope that all of you will consider how you can use the International Day to make programs about disaster risk management and to focus on initiatives which help to reduce the numbers of people likely to die in disasters. Climate risk is a huge element in this, and it is important that you also focus on your country's progress in implementing the Paris Agreement on climate. Attention should be on both measures to reduce greenhouse gases and programs designed to help people adapt to climate change in their daily lives. I'm truly sorry that I can't be with you today for this important meeting, but I thank you for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you, and I very much look forward to hearing about the outcomes of your discussions. Thank you.
And that was the video message by Mr. Robert Glasser, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the UNISDR. Now we are to begin session 1 of our second Media Summit, and this session will be on the global perspective, climate change in focus, moderated by Mr. Satinder Bindra, and I would like to give you the floor. And for your information, ladies and gentlemen, this Media Summit is also live broadcast on web TV of Thai PBS. And many viewers from around the world can also join us in this conference. They may also make comments and also any questions, and we will let the moderator know whenever the questions or comments come in from around the world. And so may I now please invite Mr. Satinder Bindra. The stage is yours.
Colleagues, fellow broadcasters, friends, and to our very distinguished two colleagues who've spoken earlier as well, I'm delighted to be here to kickstart this session on climate change and focus. As we've heard, Asia and Asians suffer disproportionately from climate change and all that comes with it, extreme weather events, storms, and cyclones. Every day, these events have become a part of our lives. So today, we're going to be putting climate change in focus. We're going to be joined first in terms of our panelists. We're going to be joined by Dr. Chris Field, and he'll be coming up on the panel here, I should think, very shortly. Let me tell you a bit about Dr. Field. From 2008 to 2015, he was part of the IPCC, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as it's called, is a very distinguished body of climate scientists. They study climate change issues, and as you know, every few years they put out a very major report which informs the entire world about the latest state of climate science. Currently, Dr. Field is the professor of environmental studies in Stanford. It's about 7:30 in the evening, and Dr. Field, this is Satinder in Krabi. Can you hear me? We still cannot hear you. Can you hear us okay? Just a few words from you.
I can hear you fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A very good evening to you, Dr. Field. We look forward to having you as one of our panelists. I'd like to introduce the other two panelists now. I'd like to call on Professor Elizabeth Eide. She's professor of journalism at the University of Oslo in Norway. She's an author, and I would say one of the best ways to describe her would also be to call her an Asia hand. She's traveled in person to many countries of Asia, including Afghanistan, Pakistan. She's lived for a year in Dehradun, India, and I look forward to exchanging many ideas with her. A very warm welcome to her. Can we give her a round? Our next panelist, friends from the media, is Dr. Siri Supradit. He is the Director, Climate Change and Disaster Center at the Rangsit University in Thailand. Can you come on up, please? Dr. Supradit, I think it would also be fair to describe you as one of the foremost disaster experts in this country, and I look forward to having a meaningful discussion with you. And I'll get proceedings started now. Well, we'll first turn, if I may, to some quick ground rules. We have about 45 minutes. I'll try to engage the audience. I'll encourage all the panelists to keep their answers short, and we can then engage all of you. And if any of you have a burning question or an issue to raise from the audience, please also raise your hands. That way we can get you involved in this. But I'd like to start the proceedings now by showing you a video. We've all known about global warming. and to explain how this can really affect us, what temperature rises can do to our planet Earth, what they can do to food, what they can do to our water. It's very important we have a perspective on this right at the top. So I'll request my colleague Nadeem to kindly roll this video, please.
Would still rise by up to 1 degree Celsius. 6,000 years ago, temperatures were at this level, and America's Midwest was a desert. The world's food production centers will become barren again. In this future, mountains lose their glaciers and rivers vanish, the Indian subcontinent fighting for survival. A single degree temperature increase could eliminate fresh water from a third of the planet within 85 years. Warming at the poles happens faster than the global average. 40% of Arctic sea ice has disappeared in the last 30 years. While ice reflects heat, oceans absorb it. So as ice melts, the process becomes self-reinforcing. More ocean surface means more heat absorbed, which raises temperatures, making the ice less likely to reform. Mountainous regions are at greater risk of landslides as the permafrost which held them together for thousands of years melts away. Low-lying countries like the Maldives are submerged as sea levels rise, and countries already hit by hurricanes face ever greater storms. At a 2-degree rise, people begin to die in what are now considered normal summers. In 2003, with temperatures 2.3 degrees above average, 52,000 people died across Europe. Plant growth slows down, then stops. They don't absorb carbon dioxide as efficiently, instead emitting it. The extra carbon sees global warming spiral out of control. 125,000 years ago, when temperatures were 2 degrees higher, sea levels were up by 6 meters. Today, that extra water makes up our polar ice, which is melting. By the year 2100, sea levels could rise by a meter, displacing 10% of the world's population. In this 2-degree future, ecosystems across the globe collapse as species migrate and fall out of sync. A third of all life on Earth faces extinction. Scientists say we can still avoid a 2-degree rise if we limit our carbon emissions to no more than 2.9 trillion tonnes. We've already used 1.9 trillion tonnes. We have 1 trillion left to use between now and forever. At the current rate, we'll use it in just 21 years.
Thank you very much. And if we can have Dr. Field back up on screen again, please. My first question will be to Dr. Field. Dr. Field, you've probably heard that video, and I guess all of us here would like to ask you, what's the latest science say? Where are temperatures right now? And where do you foresee them in the next 20 to 25 years? And as a scientist, where do you stand? How do you see developments?
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to join all of you this morning. In the 2013-2014 reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I would say that there were 3 main conclusions. The first is that warming is real. The second is that it's caused by humans. And the third is that the impacts can be limited by restricting the amount of emissions with ambitious mitigation. I think that sets the framework for all of the things we need to be talking about. When I ask myself what's changed since the release of the last reports from the IPCC, there are really 8 important things. Some concern the past. For example, when we wrote the IPCC report, we weren't sure whether temperatures had stabilized, whether there was some kind of a hiatus. We know now there wasn't. An important feature of the past is that we have seen 2 years, 2014 and 2015, where global economic activity grew substantially, but CO2 emissions didn't. This doesn't mean that CO2 emissions have peaked, but it means that we're beginning to see the early stages of disconnecting economic growth from CO2 emissions. We've seen a number of things that have solidified our understanding of the relationship between climate change and severe impacts, impacts on single event disasters and extremes, economic impacts, as the video described, and impacts of sea level rise. But I think that some of the most compelling new information we have concerns opportunities for solutions, and let me very briefly mention three. The first is that increasingly we can see the outlines of an energy system that's non-emitting. We have abundant evidence that it's technically possible and not overly expensive to create a 100% non-emitting energy system. We have the technical ability if we can simply bring forward the political will. We also see a wide variety of examples of co-benefits where investments in decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs, increasing investments in climate adaptation, and increasing investments in sustainable economic development can occur together. There's a vision of a triple win where mitigation, adaptation, and development all occur with the same investments. And then finally, I think that it's abundantly clear that the 2015 Paris Agreement is a solid foundation for action moving forward. It needs to be regarded as a ceiling, but not a floor, but the Paris Agreement provides exactly the kind of enabling environment that communities, corporations, and countries have been asking for, and I'm tremendously encouraged at the progress that led to Paris and the progress I've seen since Paris.
Thank you very much, Dr. Field. And you pointed to this delinking of emissions from some of the economic activity that goes on in every continent 24/7. You also talked about Paris, and I'm going to turn to Professor Ade here to look at Paris. It was seen as a very landmark event in 2015. Professor, key takeaways for you.
Well, for me, Paris was, I think also for the participants who were there, a kind of turning point. I come from a network called the Media Climate, and the Media Climate Network is monitoring media coverage of the climate change in 20 countries, including 4 in this region: Australia, Bangladesh, China, and Indonesia. And we found that albeit the coverage is a bit less in the media that we monitored, there is more optimism. And we also see that the business sector, also pointed out by Dr. Field, is playing an increased role in the coverage in and around the Paris summit compared to Copenhagen summit in 2009. I'd also like to, since Dr. Field is from the IPCC, to point out that we monitored the 4 reports put forward by IPCC, and we find that there is a gap between the rich and the poorer countries there. And I think it's mainly due to the fact that in the poorer countries, in many of them, there are not an abundant expertise and a kind of information hub which provides the population with this knowledge in comprehensible terms. But I'll come back to that, I guess. I had some slides too. I don't know if we can put them on. Yeah. Oh, maybe. Well, if not, that's... Oh, there they are. Well, let's see if they work. If not, we can just wait. It's all right. Oh, never mind. Just go on. Oh, yeah. No, it works poorly, but no, we'll speak. The word is fine. It comes back all the time, somehow. Never mind.
We can continue the conversation. One of the things about Paris, and it's specifically stated in Article 12, which I feel for this gathering is quite important, that the need to share information, public information, that is specifically stressed in the Paris Accord. Many of you come from countries and governments that have shared or been part of this historic agreement. And so there is a need now a greater need to share information. There's a greater need for public broadcasters, particularly, to be more forthcoming in pointing out the climate science, and as Dr. Field pointed out, the solutions as well. From your perspective,
yes,
when it comes to climate change and it comes to Thailand and this part of Southeast Asia, what patterns have you been noticing over the past 5 to 10 years? And in that sense, is the science that we are hearing translating into reality for people, that they get a sense that, wait a minute, this science is really impacting our lives?
yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to tell you that from the many, several IPCC reports, of course, we involve more than 500 scientists today to do this report. But if you see clearly in the report, there are some uncertainties. Right? So, for example, in Thailand, you know, many people in the coastal community just heard from internet that, oh, about next 10 years, Bangkok will be underwater 6 meters, something like that. Yeah? And then from the point of view of IPCC, it is impossible, something like that. Yeah? So this is really, should be very careful in terms of the science report also. Behind the report, they have some assumptions that if, for example, you know, many scenarios that IPCC report forecast, it will be a very high development growth, and then low, and then middle, something like that. Whether it will be high, middle, or low, we don't know. Right? That's why you have to pay attention. But upon that uncertainties, but we still have confirmed that the world will have a temperature increase, sure, to be at least 2 degrees in the next 50 years, something like that. Due to this outcome, IPCC, actually I have the presentation, but I don't know that you can show me or not, but at least, okay. The problem is this, with the middle development scenario, right? So they will affect on Southeast Asia so much, because of Southeast Asia is a country with climate sensitive countries almost. They are doing agriculture, right? So if the climate just changes, they will impact on them. Yeah? This year, these 2 years, especially from the El Niño, right? For Thailand, you know, if we estimate that only this year's drought will affect economics about $3 billion yeah, for Thailand. Yeah?
Well, thank you very much for that. So a real impact here in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand. But from your perspective, Professor, do you find sometimes there's a gap between the science and how it's interpreted? Who's responsible for that, and what can be done to improve it? Because the science must be clearly understood by everybody.
Yeah, and that is a large target to meet. I think the responsibility needs to be shared. I read the last report from an IPCC seminar, which was in my country actually in March this year, where the IPCC increasingly now realized that they have to communicate better. I mean, for some years they had only one really full-time communication person, and that is prioritizing communication a little bit too little. On the other hand, the journalists, you know, media want certainty, and that is, of course, a problem that you addressed, exactly, because there is uncertainty, but on the other hand, there is risk. And I think risk is a key word here, because although there are many scientific results that are still uncertain, there is also the fact that the risk is there. Another problem is perhaps that many local people who do not read IPCC reports, not even summary for policymakers, not even politicians read them, I think, to a large extent, they will connect somehow, if they've heard about climate change science, their local experiences to the climate science or to the climate change. This might be right, and spontaneously they might be right, but they might also be wrong in some cases, because this is, as was addressed earlier on by the representative, that weather or climate change. I mean, you can't always attribute everything to climate change, but on the other hand, when James Hansen, a famous climate scientist, asks any public, he says, has your house burnt down lately? No. Well, do you insure your house? Yes, I do. And then again, he asks, well, about climate change, how much insurance in sort of example of putting practice what you preach about climate change, how much do you work with that if you realize the danger? So this risk language, I think, is a key both for scientists and journalists.
Okay. Do you find sometimes, if you look at issues locally, every time there's a flood or there's a drought, I mean, of course, climate change does lead to extreme weather conditions, but can you jump to the conclusion that every rainfall, every flood, every drought is because of climate change? And that just creates a sort of unnecessary fear, and people feel, oh my gosh, this is so big that there's nothing that we can do to really deal with it. Yeah. Any experiences there?
Yeah, I think that we cannot say that everything is climate change, from climate change. Yeah, we have to clarify the word between climate change and climate variability. Yeah, during this time, El Niño coming, maybe next 2 years, La Niña come again. That is called climate variability. Right? It happens every 2 to 5 years. Right? Well, but climate change is very permanent, continuously increase in terms of temperature, something like that. Yeah, as Professor addressed, I really agree with you that in Thailand also, Thai people normally want to see very clear results of scientific knowledge, something like that. Yeah. For example, I just yesterday rainfall, very heavy rainfall in Krabi. That is the first time in 2 years that I have seen. 2 years we have no rain such as yesterday night rainfall. But if we follow up the meteorological forecasting, no rain. Something like that, something no rain. It's a very challenging that even though very short period, it's still uncertainties in that. You see, so we cannot. We cannot depend on only forecasting, but the most important is you mentioned this risk and vulnerabilities of the people. That 3 main components that IPCC stress is that the first one is of course the events, whether climate change, climate variabilities. Okay, nothing, it had to happen. But the second thing is vulnerability. We have to reduce, and the third one is exposure. These 2 kinds very important. Yeah.
Can people like you, as scientists, can you engage more directly with the citizens? Because the gap between citizens and climate scientists is still big. I met one of the IPCC scientists from France when I was in Paris for the COP, and he said he traveled in the West France and he'd been with the local people there, and he realized that when people thought it was about things they love, I mean the love factor, things, the region that they love, the nature they love, the phenomena they loved, then they would engage more when they realized that is at risk. So I think he learned from people. So can scientists learn from citizens how to communicate better too?
Yeah, we have to learn each other, of course. In order to reduce the uncertainties from the scientific point of view, they recommended to start from the local people. What are you facing now? What are you doing for your adaptations? And then to learn both together.
Of course, one of the ways to also deal with this is through the media. And I'd like to turn to the audience. You know, you have the science, you interpret it, and you can put that out to the people in the best possible way. How many of you out here feel, if I can have a show of hands, that the media has a very critical role in first understanding, interpreting, and then explaining the science? Show of hands, please. Very, very significant role for the media. How best then can, if anybody from the floor would like to take this, perhaps you could give me an example of a story perhaps any one of you would like to speak up on how you interpreted the Paris Accord or the deal. Would anyone like to take the floor? Yeah. Would anyone like to take the floor? Yes, please. You're good. We can hear you.
Okay. I think I'd like to pick up a point from Dr. Field. He used the term, if we have the political will. Yeah? Well, I think we all know that the success of the Paris Accord depends perhaps too much on the goodwill of world leaders. And the support of those who replace them can't always be guaranteed. Let me offer you one example, and I'm disappointed so far that the members of the panel have not paid any respect to the views of a prospective president of the United States. A certain Mr. Donald Trump has said he doesn't think that climate change in any major fashion exists. Now, if we don't have the support of the prospective president of the United States, does the Paris Accord work at all?
Well, a very good question. We were talking about the role of the media as well, but perhaps the question can then be, well, shouldn't the media also be highlighting some of this? But let me turn to address this to Dr. Field. Well, what do you think? We have a deal in Paris, but getting a deal and then getting something concrete out of a deal are two different things, particularly when there's lots of question marks about the political futures, particularly when it comes to the United States. What are your thoughts? How best can we get this deal from paper to implementation?
It's a great question, and it really highlights the fact that in the United States and around the world, elections matter, and this one matters really a lot. But if you look at the commitments in the United States Nationally Determined Contribution, the NDC, that came to Paris, 26 to 28% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, the striking thing you see is that all of those commitments are already embedded in existing law and existing regulatory frameworks within the United States. Certainly climate change has not been a big issue in the election debates so far, although the things that have made it into the public discourse make it clear that there is a big difference in the positions between the Democrats and the Republicans. But what's important for the world to know is that the U.S. commitments are deeply embedded in the framework of existing actions. And the big difference is whether those would be amplified, as the Democrats have both argued they would do, or whether they would be suppressed, as the Republicans and especially Mr. Trump have argued. It's hard to know, but I think the commitment of the United States as a government operating under the Obama administration is really clear, and it's as strong as any country in the world.
Well, thanks, Dr. Field. Maybe a follow-up question to you is, well, fine about the U.S. commitments. They're deeply embedded, quote unquote, as you say. But let's talk Asia if we can a bit. How do you wean away the Chinas, the Indias, the Vietnams, and the Indonesias away from coal? Because Asian emissions now are about a third of the world's total. And if you can't do that, and if you can't do that quickly, then the Paris deal might unravel quickly, may it not?
It is certainly true that major emitters, especially China, are critically important for determining next steps. I think that the U.S.-China bilateral agreement, which was announced in November of 2014, absolutely essential. You should understand that as the foundation, the keystone in the emergence of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's very clear from a worldwide perspective that the U.S. needs to be actively involved, and from a U.S. perspective, China needs to be actively involved. Those two actors basically set the framework on which the rest of the world can work. As long as the US and China are deeply committed to progress on climate, it creates an environment where the Indias, the Vietnams, the Thailands, the Indonesias see a strong motivation for increasing their ambition. If we see wavering commitment in the United States or China, it becomes much harder for the world to sustain the kind of ambition that's going to be required to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
Yes, as an observer of the COPs, the climate
Conference
summits.
of Parties.
Yes, I know. I feel there's a difference between the Obama approach in 2009 and in 2015. In 2009, he sort of sidelined even the EU. I come from the outskirts of the EU, by the way. And he met with the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. On this summit in Paris, he actually called upon the vulnerable nations and had a meeting with them. And I think that might have been at least one of the factors behind that the 1.5 degree target was set up. But if I could have shown one more slide now, because governments go to in Asia particularly, go to great lengths to demonstrate the political, let's say, despair that they have. This is an attempt of the government of Maldives in 2009 to have their first sub-water government conference, and Nepal and Mongolia did the same thing. And I think that speaks to the vulnerable nations and their problems of getting their message across. On the other hand, in the nations that are not so vulnerable, I think we have, unless, I don't like to say this, but there is a difference between commitments and practice. And particularly when it comes to the compensation scheme, which is about loss and damage, which is about compensation to the vulnerable nations. Norwegian Prime Minister from before, he was head of that climate fund, and he spoke in Durban in 2011, and he said, well, we have to fund the fund. And still, you could say the same thing in 2016, we have to fund this fund. It hasn't happened yet to some extent, which is really impressive.
We have a question from the audience. We'll just turn to you in a moment. But Dr. Supratit, to you, yes. A lot of commitments were made in Paris, and now is a question of practice where you've really got to, if you've got to decarbonize, that means you've got to step up renewable usage. You've got to look at efficiency in your energy usage. Do you think the media has a role here to continuously report? If Japan has signed on to something, if Thailand has signed on to something, if Indonesia and India have signed on to something, do the media and all reporters in these countries continue to report on progress or lack thereof? Is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, actually, I don't know in detail in the COP21's Paris Agreement, but I also raised some question that if we compare between Kyoto Protocol and this agreement, what is it better or worse? We don't know, still we don't know, right? And of course, I think that in Paris Agreement, there are no legal binding also, right? So it's difficult to fulfill the goal, and that one thing. You mentioned about the renewable energy. I think Thailand really compared to Southeast Asia, we are very see that if you travel around Thailand, you can see any solar farm in here. But sometimes the people, even though Thai academicians said that, oh, we release the greenhouse emission not more than 1% of the world, right? So we don't want to disseminate such climate change or global warming too much, something like that. But in terms of the adaptation, it must be more important than the mitigations. Yeah, in terms of the Thai people.
Of your own country.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that's debatable because mitigation is also important, because if you've got to do a bit of both, I think is what many people would argue. Yeah. But we have a question from the floor. So if you could please state your name and the organization you represent. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sharad Sadhu. My name card says EWBS, but I am a broadcaster by profession. I would like to say that it is nobody's case that the global warming is good for us. We all know that it's bad for the humanity. So that's done. The point is that as a common citizen, as a common man, I really don't know how I can contribute to elimination of the effects of the global warming, how I reduce the effect of warming as a citizen. Whenever I feel like driving, I go out and drive. Whenever I feel like using energy, I do go and use energy. There is nothing that is told to me that you reduce this consumption. There is no directive from the governments. There are no guidelines from the governments. And that might actually lead to the role of the media. There is a Paris Agreement, we all know about it. But what should I do at the end of the day to implement that as an individual? I really don't know about it. So we really have to enable the reduction of all the gases and the energy for making the environment better. The other issue is that somebody spoke about the Mr. Trump's views. Now this is a point which I want to emphasize. Just because the media is focusing on a particular region or a particular issue, we all know about it. But other issues that we have, like the climate change, we really don't know about it. We really don't know. So is it a case that the media should come forward and the government should become more proactive in actually telling the people, in actually planning reduction of all these effects? And how do they go about it? Thank you.
Yes, please. I'm very happy with that question. I think on one hand, we've seen now how media across the globe can cooperate better to reveal certain facts. For example, the Panama Papers. I also read that in the Thai papers these days. I wish the media could play as active a watchdog role when it comes to climate change. But there is an obstacle there, and that is that within the media you have kind of two different ideological positions. One is that you should report objectively, and in some countries that has meant giving quite a lot of space to climate denialists, even today. In other countries, this is mainly the Anglo-Saxon language countries, by the way, as we see in our research. On the other hand, there is the watchdog role, and these two are not always conciliable. I mean, either you're the watchdog or you are the sort of neutral reporter. But in this increased clarity and consensus of the IPCC, I think the watchdog role could be more emphasized. When it comes to Trump, I think what we've seen in the US also with previous presidents is that the states, the single states of the United States, they do their thing a little bit independent of the presidency, so we shouldn't lose all hope even if.
But a very good question, if I might say, because in the context of what we're talking about here, should the role of the media be merely to, quote, frighten, or is it also to enlighten? So what about solutions? And let's talk about some solutions. If there's anybody else in the audience who feels that their station, their broadcasting has highlighted some good solutions, then I'm very willing to hear those. But I can even ask the panelists, what do you think in terms of solutions? Would you feel that the media has a very important role to play when if there's a good geothermal project somewhere, if there's good public transportation somewhere, if there's good renewable energy that's being used somewhere, is this as important to inspire people as is the reporting of just the science as well?
I
Professor.
think media has to move away from the bad news or the news to good news or increasingly the news. And I think we've seen contours of that happening in many countries actually by highlighting local progress, which links up. There's an example from Uganda, which is part of our sample, by the way, where you see how a local school uses biogas and thereby educates the students, prevents climate change to a very small scale, but still, and they also have a more clean environment because of that. So, I mean, to promote such local examples, I think is of uttermost importance, actually.
Would you care to answer as well?
Yeah, I agree with you, Professor. One thing is that I feel that most of media would like to sell their news by disseminating very extreme events, actually extreme. But we don't have any best practice for the media to show regularly program or documentary, right, to increase the awareness, as the Thai PBS General Director says. We seldom see that. Okay.
Let me turn to Dr. Field. Are you still there, Doctor?
I am. I'm having trouble hearing the questions. If you could just repeat briefly, that would be great.
Yes. The question to you is, do you feel that the media sometimes just reports, 5 islands in the Solomon Island chain have sunk recently? They report the disasters, but when it comes to the solutions and best practice, is there a role for them to do more?
Well, let me say first of all that it is really important that the impacts of climate change, especially those that are effectively attributed, stay sharply in the public focus. And I really want to commend the global media for keeping attention on the risks and the way those play out in particular places. The human stories are always so compelling. But I do think that it's important that people learn more and more about the things that can be done to address climate change, and the way that investments in climate change can play a role in building strong economies and vibrant communities. The world is now ripe with examples of communities and companies and countries taking smart actions that are paying off. Those often aren't the stories that lead the 6 o'clock news, but they're stories that need to find a way into our collective narratives. And I find myself turning now very frequently to the business pages of the newspaper, because that's where I'm seeing the stories about investments in climate solutions that are really working.
Dr. Field, thank you. We'll take a question from the floor, please. Yes?
I think what Dr. Field says, the information flow is unidirectional. We all know about COP, we all know about Paris Agreement, we all know. But how many people in the developed countries, they know about a remotest village in Himalayas at Zanskar Valley abandoned because the species have vanished? There are so many stories. Really, there is a dire need that, the channels of the developed countries should give space, and should encourage the countries where actually the impact of climate change has become so obvious, so vulnerable.
Thanks a lot for that question. We have also interviewed a lot of journalists who work in climate change. We find that many of them struggle to have more space for that kind of reporting in the newsroom. And we are facing a media world, well, not only newspapers, but also other media institutions with less resources. So there's a constant struggle for resources to do the stories that you're talking about. And I think also that the elite citizen gap has to be more closed if we should be able to raise the public consciousness. And that, again, to have a public consciousness and citizen care is vital also for the media, because the media have to cater to the people.
Well, with that, colleagues and friends, we are at our time, but I'd just like to quickly sum up just 3 quick takeaways that have been decided in this session. First is that the science is very, very important. The science must be reported accurately. If there's a gap between the science and what people on the street perceive, that's something that must be closed or rectified. Professor, your point, that's point 2. And the third is the climate impact stories, how it affects populations, small villages up in the Himalayas. Those must be reported. But what's also equally important is we look at best practice and we look at solutions, because solutions also inspire. And I'd like to close on a hopeful and an inspiring note, because we all have to work together for this, for the betterment of the planet and for the sake of the planet. Allow me to thank, first of all, Dr. Field in Stanford. It's getting late for you. It's almost 8:15, so we thank you for your wisdom and your time both. Good night, sir.
Thank you for the chance to participate. I really enjoyed it.
I'd also like to thank Professor Supratit. Thank you for your views and your wisdom as well. It's been a pleasure to meet you here. I look forward to meeting you again.
Sure. Thank you.
and to Professor Ade, all the way from Norway. It's been a delight to hear your views. Thank you all colleagues for listening, and over from us. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for the first session. And now we will have a break, a coffee break. And please be back here by 10:45. Thank you.